feature down at the bottom of your screen. And while you're doing that, I'm going to welcome on Jensen Bissell, our next speaker.
Thanks, Aaron. It's really a pleasure to talk about the scientific forest management area, an area that is a significant part of the park, but somewhat unrecognized. So I think it's great to have a chance to talk to people who are interested, and I appreciate everyone who tuned in was interested. Alec gave a great bird's eye view of forestry and forest management. I'm going to try and give a discussion about how the SFMA came to be in Governor Baxter's mind, and then a brief overview of the history of management, which is also very interesting in this specific area of the park. It's interesting to note that Percival Baxter took about 32 years to create the park, from 1931 to 1962. It's also surprising to many people to realize that his first gift, when he deeded his first gift to the state of Maine in 1931, he was in his mid-50s. He'd already had a full career as a governor and a politician and a philanthropist, but he set about in this mission, and by the time he was ready for his first gift, he was a 56-year-old or so. His last gift in 1963, he was almost 90 years old. He was 89 years old. The two gifts that comprised the SFMA were offered in 1955. He was in his mid-80s. He'd been working at this for a long time. He gave 28 different gifts to the state of Maine over that 32-year period. The SFMA, I think, are gifts 26 and 27. It's interesting to note that in these gifts, he shifted gears almost completely. The words forever wild and natural wild state that encompassed almost all of his previous gifts disappeared from the language of communication that the governor offered for the management of the scientific forest management area. Remember, he provided a deed. He gave the land to the state of Maine. Then he also provided communication specifying to the legislature how he would like the land managed in perpetuity. So his next to last gifts were this kind of very different area, for very rolling terrain, not mountainous. And he specified a lot of discussion about forestry. Now, why would he do that? Now, the pictures you're seeing were pictures I took in 1992. I was very fortunate to be able to accompany a group of mostly Maine foresters on a couple of week tour through Germany and Switzerland to look at forests there and talk with forest managers about what they saw. I was firmly aware at the time that Governor Baxter, during his lifetime, clearly ascribed to Mark Twain's idea that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. He traveled almost every year of his life. He covered almost, not Antarctica or the Arctic or Australia, but every other continent in the world he spent some time in. He was an astute observer, and as Alec has mentioned, he was always considerate about his home state of Maine, how it was managed, how the resources were, and he was looking very carefully at what he saw in other countries and comparing them. These kinds of photos that I show you were places we visited, and I'm pretty sure that some of the places were likely seen by Percival Baxter 50 years earlier. It's interesting to note, and Alec didn't mention this, but he is very versed on it, that all of these areas that I looked at in Germany and Switzerland and France suffered through what Europe would refer to as the timber famine. So their forests are beautiful and well managed, but they learned that lesson the hard way. For about 2 centuries, they had run out of wood after severe overcutting and mismanagement, and it took them a couple hundred years to get their act together and realize that forests are good for society over the long term. And they instituted a number of social and legal and political laws to ensure that forests were managed sustainably and carefully for future generations. What I was seeing, and what I think Governor Baxter was seeing, was the results of that. And they were very impressive. They inspired me. I'm almost certain that they inspired Governor Baxter. So when he wrote his communications for the scientific forest management area, he put a whole different set of wording together. He said, "It's long been my purpose to create in our forests a large area wherein the state may practice the most modern methods of forest control, reforestation, and production. In my travels in foreign lands, I've seen great, beautiful, great forests that for centuries have been producing a crop of wood without depletion. In Sweden, Norway, Finland, Germany, Chile, Russia, and elsewhere, What has been done by scientifically controlled forestry can be done in Maine. I now make it possible for the state to try a major experiment here at home, an experiment that can mean much for our future timber supply, which all admit is the chief natural resource of our state. I want this township to become a showplace for those interested in forestry, a place where a continuing timber crop can be cultivated, harvested, and sold, where reforestation and scientific cutting will be employed, an example and an inspiration to others. What is done in our forest today will help or harm the generations who follow us. As you look through these pictures too, I'm reminded of Alec's comments about aesthetics. It's overwhelming that the aesthetics were strong. These forests were beautiful. And I can think of many forests in Maine that don't hold that kind of effect to me. They're not beautiful. They strike me differently. I'm sure he was struck by the same kind of aesthetic feeling and the understanding that they were well managed. So this had a great effect on him. He was very good friends with Albert Nutting, who was a forest commissioner in Maine and later became dean of the School of Forestry at Orono. And he had conversations with Al Nutting about this idea and asked him questions, and Al gave him answers, and he firmed up this idea and then gave these two gifts in 1955. So let's move on to the management history of this area. So in 1955, this becomes a part of the park. It's important to realize that, as Alec has pointed out, there aren't any roads up there. No wood has been harvested or trucked by road. This has been a waterborne enterprise for 100 years. So there's no way to really cut and move wood other than doing it in the winter and sledding it on the snow and ice down to a waterway and then flushing it down in the spring. And there were 20 years from any roads being there. In 1955, the park was a tiny organization with a handful of employees who were funded with appropriations from the Maine state legislature. The idea of conducting forest management in this far northern corner of the park didn't enter anybody's mind, and it wouldn't for a very long period of time. What happened, though, was that the SFMA was kind of pushed into the limelight suddenly, rather violently, by a certain event. When Percival Baxter purchased land for the park, he was generally purchasing it from mill owners and woodland owners who viewed the forests on that land as a supply of natural resource. They were reluctant to part with that. And one of the methods that Percival Baxter used very effectively throughout his tenure of buying land and deeding it to construct the park was to provide the idea of cutting rights to the seller. In other words, I'll buy this land, you'll deed it to me, but from the date of sale, you'll have a certain period of negotiated time to cut the wood on the property. Usually it was 10 years. This occurred on many of the lands in the park that the governor sold. They were cut after he actually bought the land. His last parcel that he purchased, which was something like 5,000 or 7,000 acres, and it formed the southern entrance to the park. So when you go through the Hogue Pond Gate, you're looking at the last purchase that the governor made to construct the park in 1963. When he made that deal with Great Northern, he allowed 10 years of cutting rights on that parcel. People kind of forgot about that, but in 1972, the governor had passed away. The trust funds had become available to the authority, and the size and operation of the park had expanded rapidly to something that is somewhat similar to what we see today. In 1972, 1 year from the 10-year anniversary date of that deed of sale, Great Northern announced that they intended to cut the lands that they had available to them on the southern end of the park. This raised a lot of consternation with the authority. They didn't really want to see the opening and the entrance to the park become a clear cut that would be available for people to see for 40 or 50 years. What they quietly thought of in discussions with Great Northern is, well, we really don't want you to cut this land on the southern end of the park, but we have this area in the north end of the park where we're supposed to cut wood and harvest wood and manage it. So what about a swap? And that was quietly agreed to. There were some details of the deal. Great Northern was much happier with the wood and the kind of softwood and the amount of softwood in the forest management area in the northwest corner of the park. But roads had just become available. They'd have to build another 10 or 20 miles of road in order to get into the area. That was a cost to them. I think the flip side of that is they would get a lot more wood, like almost the entire forest management area. Great Northern wrote up a management plan that is, as I remember seeing it when I first started working, was 2 or 3 pages long. And it had a map. on the back of one page that showed all the roads that we built in the entire area. I think the authority was ready to go through with this, but it got out and the public saw it, and many voices were raised that perhaps this wasn't a good example of exemplary forestry. This isn't what the governor really had in mind. The authority considered that, recognized there's merit to that, and stopped the idea of swapping with Great Northern, but they still had the problem of the cutting rights and Great Northern's plan to cut on the southern end of the park. Before that happened, in the 10 years previous to that, careful management by the authority had accumulated what they call the rainy day fund. It was about $800,000. $800,000 in 1972 is about $3.8 million in today's value. So it wasn't an insignificant amount of money. As it turns out, Great Northern said, well, you can buy us out of these cutting rights, but it'll be $725,000. So the authority considered expending all of their saved rainy day fund in order to prevent that from happening, and agreed to do it. So they ended up much poorer, but with the forests on the southern end of the park preserved. But it also cast a very strong amount of attention on the scientific forest management area for the first time since its inception in 1955. The authority began to consider, well, if we have this area and it's cost us $800,000 not to cut on the southern end of the park, why don't we begin operations up there? And so that began the idea of operating in the SFMA. They hired a park forester in 1979, I think. There was earlier, his name was George Rupp. There was an initial forest management plan. Harvesting was assembled and started. As Alec has pointed out, it's important to remember that this harvesting all commenced in pretty much the middle of Maine's spruce budworm epidemic. And the problem with that is that markets were very difficult. There'd been a flood of spruce and fir that went into the market it was called pre-salvage. Landowners were worried about losing this volume to the spruce budworm, so they cut it early and sent it into mills. And so there was a difficult marketing period, but cutting proceeded. The park forester eventually left, and the park decided not to rehire an in-house person, and instead to contract this idea with the Maine Forest Service, use foresters from the Maine Forest Service to manage the harvest in the park, and the park would just basically observe. Fred Rooney came on scene as a Maine Forest Service forester and conducted the management of harvesting, and then he was followed by Dennis Brennan. At some point, controversy built again as people began to look at the effects and the kind of style of harvesting that was being practiced and raised the issue that it really wasn't what Baxter had in mind. There were slash piles along the edge of the road as wood was yarded tree-length to the roadside and delimbed at the roadside. So there were 12-foot high and quarter-mile long piles of slash at the roadside. That thing about aesthetics that Alec had mentioned was severely lacking. And there was some issues about oversight and what wood was actually being cut and what wood was not being cut. The authority, again, stopped harvesting, considered the thoughts and opinions of people. They appointed a blue ribbon committee to do a further investigation and look at the harvesting and report back. That committee informed the authority that they largely agreed with what was assessed, that this really wasn't what Baxter had in mind. They recommended that the authority hire, again, an in-house manager in the park, and that the park proceed to try to do the kind of forestry that the governor had in mind. Now, that was 1985, and I was hired in 1986 as that forester. The Blue Ribbon Committee became my advisory committee, a committee that is still in place today, a committee that was incredibly helpful to me as we went through this process. Most of the folks on the advisory committee were smarter than me, very knowledgeable about forestry. We didn't all agree on everything. There was lots of disagreement within the committee, but we played well together and everyone was pulling in the same direction. So we began to make progress over the next 17 years. I worked there in this process for 17 years. I installed most of the road system in the SFMA during that system, and I put in the first ideas and the first iterations of management and the schemas for data collection and management. Since my time, those have all been vastly improved upon. I left the SFMA in 2005 to move to the park directorship. In the 17 years that I worked, I greatly enjoyed my time there. In the 17 years after that, there were 5 additional managers that came to work on the SFMA. I don't know if you can put those up, Aaron, but the first one was after me was Carol Rettelsheimer. Carol was a great northern forester that I had known and been on the committee. That's Carol right there. Carol worked there for a number of years and applied. I realized that every forester that works in the SFMA will apply their own fingerprints to how their management is. Carol certainly did in her time. Then following Carol, we hired Rick Morrill, and Rick again did so much good for the SFMA and applied his own fingerprint, and reluctantly left to take a family business in Vermont, which I think he's been very successful with. And then after Rick, we hired Eben Sipitkowski, who ended up eventually moving on to the park directorship. Eben again applied his own fingerprint to the SFMA and how it would be managed. Eben then, upon his movement to the park directorship, hired Mike Punch to continue with that process. Again, Mike, I think here is talking with the more current version of the SFMA Advisory Committee that started 25 years ago as a blue ribbon panel to assist the authority. After Mike, Shane Miller came on to manage the SFMA. I'll end on this note. When I was in Germany, some of the forests we looked at had been under management for 200 years. And it wasn't uncommon if you went into a headquarters or a primary building of the forest management administration to see a line of photos on the wall. There might be 10 folks in a row. And it was very clear, they explained very clearly that all these were forest managers and they all worked about 20 years. And so you can do the math in your head about how long people have been involved in that single forest and managing it. And I think we're on our way to a similar kind of history with this area in Maine that I think we are slowly evolving into, hopefully, what the governor had in mind. But that's a little background, brings you up to, I think, the current state of affairs with the SFMA.
Thank you so much, Jensen.